The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in this webinar entitled 2018 Rainforest Alliance Impacts Report, Partnership Learning and Change. My name is Deanna Newsom. I'm Senior Manager in the Evaluation and Research Program and co-author of this report with Jeff Milder, who's Director of the ENR program. And what I'd like to do today is provide you with a bit of background about our approach to looking at impacts, go over the results of what we found, and also talk about how we're implementing programs and efforts to address the challenges identified in the report. The goal of the 2018 Rainforest Alliance Impacts Report was essentially to evaluate the effects of the RA certification program from 2015 to 2017. Our first impacts report came out in 2015, so we're moving beyond that and focusing on the period of time between then and the close of 2017. So what we tried to do in this report was review and synthesize existing research, conduct some new analyses to address key topics, and present the findings clearly and credibly so that RA stakeholders can understand them and use them themselves. We also wanted to use the findings and insights internally to help drive improvement and focus new investment on key challenges. I'll just start with a quick slide showing what the high-level findings of the report were before going into the details of these throughout the rest of the report. We found that the number of certified farms and farmer groups is at an all-time high. New independent research has come out since 2015 that supports previous findings that RA certification is associated with productivity increases, higher income, and reduced poverty. Other research found that certification contributes to healthier natural ecosystems, not just on the farm, but in the surrounding landscape. We also found that as farms remain in the system for 2 or more years, their sustainability practices tend to improve over time. And recent changes to the RA standard, which I'll describe later, we will enhance this effect further. We also found that a minority of sustainability topics remain persistent challenges for farmers in certain crops and locations. And we found that we need more research on impacts, especially in the banana and tea sectors. So some of the methods we use to compile the information that's presented in this report, one of the sources of information is, of course, scientific research, and this is research that's conducted by scientists in universities or independent research institutes. So we scanned the literature to see what was available, and we had some criteria for including research in our report. One criterion was that the report be published in 2016 or later, because we obviously didn't want to repeat what we'd been presenting in the 2015 impacts report. We also only included scientific research that sought to evaluate the effects of one or more of our strategies. So typically these strategies looked at our farmer training or certification. And they needed to be looking at the effects of these strategies on the specific outcomes and impacts that are identified in Rainforest Alliance's theory of change. So these are things like biodiversity conservation, farmer and family well-being, those types of outcomes and impacts. We also only included research that included a credible point of comparison. So they needed to be comparing our farms to a control group of non-certified producers, or they needed to be assessing changes over time. A sort of a description of a narrative of the great things happening on a Rainforest Alliance certified farm just at one point in time would not be included in our analysis. So in addition to the scientific research identified as described in the previous slide, we also conducted our own analysis, which is what we call a compliance analysis. And this is using information that's found in every farm audit report. So as you may know, during the audit process, auditors indicate the level of farm compliance with each of the criteria of the certification standard. And so auditors either designate that compliance level as full compliance, partial compliance, or non-compliance. So in our analysis, we took those results and those compliance levels, and we gave them a numerical value. So for full compliance, we gave a farm 100 points. for partial compliance 50 points, or for non-compliance 0 points. And then we lumped all the farms together in a certain region for a certain crop. So for example, tea farms in East Africa would be one grouping that we thought was important to look at. And we calculated for each of the criteria in the standard, we calculated the average compliance score. So all those combinations of 100s, 50s, and zeros, we averaged them out for a single criterion, and that was what we called the compliance score. We did this for 383 certificates, and we also made sure to do that for 2 certificates over time for each farm. This allows us to look at how compliance rates change and learn something about which areas are not seeing improvement and which are. So that was a total of 766 audit reports. And even though we calculated these results for all of the criteria in the standard, we focused in this presentation and in the report on the 41 criteria that most directly addressed 3 salient topics. And I'll describe those on the next slide, because we really wanted to focus on 3 areas that we and our stakeholders thought were very important to address. And just one methodological note, we only looked at non-critical criteria because by default, the critical criteria, which are mandatory, will always have a score of 100 because that's a prerequisite to getting certified. So we didn't include those in our analysis because that would have skewed the results higher than. So moving on, these are the 3 focal areas that we chose to look at in depth in this analysis. Protecting and improving the livelihoods of farmers and farm workers. There were 17 criteria that we included here, and they're described in a bit more detail to the right. Conserving natural ecosystems, there were 10 criteria that we thought addressed this topic that we looked at. And minimizing pesticide use and risk, here there were 14 criteria. And those are described over to the right in a bit more detail. So just a note before I move on, we also had another source of information which isn't described in this presentation, but I think enhances the report itself quite a bit. So in addition to the scientific results and the compliance analysis here, we also have interviews in the report with farmers, with farm workers, with scientists who study our work, with scientists who were involved in the revision of the certification standard. So there's a lot of nuance and depth, I think, in those interviews that you'll greatly enjoy if you have some time to flip through the impacts report itself and read those. So Rainforest Alliance's global reach. I wanted to spend a few slides just giving you the big picture of where we are in terms of production volumes and certified producers and how those have changed over time. So here we have the number of certified producers from 2008 to 2017, coming in at about 1.3 million at the close of 2017. These numbers refer to individual farms and farmers who are members of groups. If we were to track certificates only and not the individual group members of group certificates, that would be about 2,100 certificates at the close of 2017. This slide shows the growth in production area as well as total farm area between the years of 2018 and the close of 2017. So both of those variables sort of dipped a bit in 2015, but have seen sustained growth since then. Rainforest Alliance production area by crop. In terms of hectares certified, cocoa farms are the majority, or have the highest number, almost 800,000 hectares, followed by tea, Arabica coffee, and banana. And those are the 4 crops, coffee, tea, cocoa, and banana, that I'll go into in depth in subsequent section of this report or this presentation. The production area by country, just to get a sense of where most of our certified farms are. Côte d'Ivoire has the highest amount of certified farm area, followed by Brazil, Kenya, and India. And finally, a little bit of a global look at where you can find certified products, Rainforest Alliance certified products in stores and where they're being produced. The vibrant blue color shows countries where certified products are both produced and sold in stores. The green which is mostly what you see there, is countries where their products are sold only but are not actually produced. There's 2 countries, Senegal and Togo, where certified products are produced but are all sent out for export and not sold in country. Those are a little hard to see, but they're in West Africa. So now I'd like to move on to coffee and take an in-depth look at what we found in the coffee sector. So some production trends, moving from the left, the round visual you see there shows the percentage of global coffee production that's Rainforest Alliance certified and how that's changed over time. We see 3.2% is Rainforest Alliance certified in 2011, up to 5.6% in 2016, which is the last year for which global production volumes are available for our calculation. The middle graphic shows the change in farm area in hectares over time, kind of reflecting the dip we saw in the earlier graphic and sustained increase since about 2014. And production amounts in metric tons of actual beans, that's showed the growth there shown between 2013 and 2017. Now I'd like to spend a couple slides familiarizing you with the new impacts research that's come out in the past 3 years. Coffee is the sector that has the most research, and so there's going to be about 4 slides here, each one presenting the results of an individual study. So there's a study that came out in Ethiopia, or was done in Ethiopia. It found that Rainforest Alliance certification was associated with higher coffee income and total household income than non-certified farms. This was a comparison of 81 Rainforest Alliance certified farms, 189 organic and fair trade, and 155 non-certified. And I'll just note the results of this study and the citation for where to find it are all available in more detail in the impacts report itself. Or you can contact me afterwards if you would like me to send you the paper. Another study on coffee was conducted in Uganda. This found that Rainforest Alliance 4C UTS joint certified farms, so farms with all 3 of those certifications in Uganda, demonstrate higher coffee yields and income and lower poverty rates than non-certified farms. Interestingly, these researchers found that the income was mostly due to higher yields and not price premiums. Another study conducted in Brazil found that Rainforest Alliance certification was associated with positive economic returns for coffee farms. This was a comparison of 24 certified and 54 non-certified coffee farms in Brazil over a multi-year period, with profits increasing on certified farms by $670 per hectare per year and decreasing on nearby non-certified farms over the same time period. And again, the increases here were attributed to the increases in profit were attributed to yield increases and not price increases for certified products. Another study, this one looked not at economic, but at ecological characteristics of forests in Ethiopia. Here, they found that Rainforest Alliance certification was associated with higher quality forest and reduced deforestation outside of certified coffee boundaries. This was a study that was conducted using satellite imagery that compared differences between 2005 and 2010 in the characteristics of certified and non-certified farms, both within the forest boundaries, within the farm boundaries and outside of the farm boundaries. So I've just presented you the new research since 2015, but I think it's still valuable to reflect and quickly go over the impacts research that was reported in the 2015 impacts report, because this is also still relevant to our work. Again, look at that report if you'd like any of the details and citations for these studies. But for coffee, which was the biggest body of research for the 4 crops we'll look at, researchers also found that compared with non-certified coffee farms, Rainforest Alliance farms had higher on-farm tree species diversity, rates of tree planting outside of the farm, more habitat, greater connectivity, higher migratory bird survivorship, and as well as some socioeconomic variables such as more years of schooling for farm children and more productivity. Again, similar to our recent results, finding that price premiums are modest. So now I'd like to present the results of our compliance analysis. So this was the analysis of compliance rates, either full, partial, or non-compliance for each of the criteria in the standard. I'm just going to spend a minute going over this graph because you're going to see it again for other regions. So if you recall, I'm going to use my mouse here, the scores that we calculated for each criterion could range between 0 non-compliance and 100 of full compliance. So we've broken them down into categories. So 90 to 100, 80 to 89, 70 to 79, or a compliance score of 60 or less. And so what these bars here show is for the group of criteria, so looking at this first bar, the group of 17 criteria that address livelihoods of farmers and farm workers, of those 17, just over 40% of them had a compliance score of 90 or above. Roughly 40% of those criteria also had an average compliance score of 80 to 89. Roughly 10% of those had a score of 70 to 79 or 60 or less. So essentially what we're looking for here is the more dark green and sort of medium green, better. That's what we, that shows very high rates of compliance of scores of 90 to 100. So they've been broken down by the 3 categories we looked at. So criteria addressing livelihoods, criteria addressing natural ecosystem conservation, and criteria addressing pesticide use and risk. So you can see the results here. I also, for each of the regions we looked at, so this is the data for coffee farms in Central America. I want to tell you a little bit about the challenge areas. So these 60 or less criteria, so those criteria that had an average score of 60 or less, remember 50 is partial compliance. The topics that were addressed by those criteria are medical exams and emergency response plans for this region and this crop. If you remember, I mentioned in the methods overview that we also looked at changes over time by doing these calculations for 2 audit reports for each operation, for each certificate. So what this is telling us here is that for the 41 criteria that we looked at in detail, 5 of those saw improvements in their compliance score of 10 or more points. So that means they either went from 90 to 100, they might have gone from 45 to 55 or 45 to 60. A change of at least 10 points is what this number shows. So 5 of those criteria saw such improvements. 2 of the 41 criteria we looked at saw decreases in performance of 10 points or more. So this is the basic information I'm going to provide for each of the crop region combinations, so coffee farms in Central America in this case. We also looked separately at coffee farms in Brazil. Here we looked at 30 certificates. A lot of dark green, so for each of the categories, at least 80% of the criteria had average compliance scores of 90 or above. The challenge areas identified here, so these are the lightest color boxes, so those criteria centered on integrated pest management, soil erosion prevention, and overtime pay. Oops, sorry. We saw that 3 of the 41 criteria saw increases of at least 10 points, and 0 of the criteria saw decreases over time. So to kind of pull this all together, all of the information that we have about coffee, some of the conclusions we can draw that new research bolsters the previous findings that Rainforest Alliance certification is associated with higher productivity, higher quality shade cover, off-farm improvements, such as what we call the spillover effect, and modest or non-existent price premiums. New research also finds lower poverty on RA coffee farms compared to non-certified farms. The challenge areas were pretty diverse and there was no trend among regions, but they covered topics such as medical exams, emergency response plans, integrated pest management, soil erosion, and overtime pay. So moving on to tea, I'll present the same information in the same order. Here we have production trends going from roughly 9% of global production being Rainforest Alliance certified in 2011 up to nearly 20% in 2016. The middle graphic showing the increase in farm area over time, pretty much a steady increase between 2010 and 2017, mirrored by the production numbers on the far right in metric tons. Unfortunately, we didn't find any new research since 2015 that looked explicitly at tea farms, Rainforest Alliance tea farms, comparing them to non-certified. But we'll just quickly go over the results that were presented in the 2015 impacts report. Here we found this research. There were two studies, one in Kenya and one in India. They found that certified farmers received a price premium, but in this case, there was no difference in net income and productivity, unlike coffee. They found that certified farms treat hired workers better. They have a higher annual pay, higher overtime pay rate, more contracts, more paid leave, sick leave, and maternity leave, and that was found in both regions studied. The research found that certified farms have more workers who report positive changes to their health and fewer ailments and are more satisfied with their housing than non-certified farms. And this research also found higher rates of school attendance for workers' children. Moving on to the compliance analysis. So here we're looking at tea farms in India. And just to recap, these are showing the percentages of criteria in each of these categories that fall into these compliance score classes. So dark green showing an average compliance score of 90 or above. The challenge areas that were identified in this region were buffers between crops and areas of human activity and safe agrochemical storage. We found 7 of the 41 criteria showed increases of at least 10% over time, and none showed decreases. Moving to Indonesia, results visible here. Some of the challenge areas were, again, a recurring theme: buffers between crops and areas of human activity, inventory and reduction of agrochemicals, and no surplus or banned agrochemicals kept on site. Those fell into the 70 to 79 category. Here, there were none in the 60 or less category. Here we saw that 5 of the 41 criteria showed improvements of at least 10 points over time, and 2 showed decreases of at least 10 points. So the last tea region we'll look at is tea farms in East Africa. Good performance for natural ecosystems and livelihoods, a little weaker with pesticides. The challenge areas identified were inventory and reduction of agrochemicals, and we saw increases of at least 10 points for 5 of the 41 criteria we examined and decreases in 3. So some conclusions about tea. Obviously more research is needed. It's quite sparse in the research field. There are consistent challenge areas among regions, and those are the use of buffers and agrochemical inventory and safety. And we saw in the tea farms a relatively high number of criteria where the compliance score increases by at least 10 points over time. Cocoa. Production trends. Here we see increases from 2.4% of global production being Rainforest Alliance certified to 10.2 in 2016. Production trends a little bit different. Peaks reached in 2013 and 2014 with a dip in 2015, but then sort of a slow recovery. Only one study was available that looked at cocoa farms, and this was conducted in Ghana. In this study, the researchers asked 15 households producing certified cocoa and 15 producing non-certified to reflect on the changes that had occurred on their farms in the past 5 years, which is the period after which the certified farms had achieved certification. So certified farmers reported positive changes in 21 of the 23 ecosystem characteristics that the researchers asked about. And you can see over to the right, that graphic shows 5 of those ecosystem characteristics in the results. There was mostly no change for non-certified farmers or decreases, or in some cases, no data reported. Certified farms also reported positive changes in all financial capital variables, and non-certified farms reported no change or negative changes. Farmers also reported that yields had increased or were different, 475 kilograms per hectare on certified versus 169 on non-certified. And the certified farms also reported improvements in pesticide management and black pod disease prevention practices. There's a little bit more research in the years leading up to the 2015 impacts report. So here we summarize that. That research found that compared to non-certified farms, Rainforest Alliance farms were more productive, had higher quality cocoa, had a higher income, and a more positive farmer outlook, although some certified farmers were reported to be unhappy with their income despite the productivity gains in that study. And they have better soil fertility properties. The compliance analysis, so cocoa farms in general showing a higher percentage of criteria in this 60 or less compliance score category. These results here are from cocoa farms in Indonesia. This is only from 10 farms, and so this is one of the lower sample sizes, so that is also a consideration. The challenge areas identified in these 60 or less category are medical exams, soil fertilization, buffers, shade cover and tree species diversity, and agrochemical inventory reduction and storage. We found that 9 of the 41 criteria we examined had increases of at least 10 points in their compliance score, and 3 had decreases. Cocoa farms in West Africa, here our sample size was 58 farms. Again, relatively many criteria in the 60 or less category. The challenge areas quite similar: soil fertilization, buffers, shade cover and tree species diversity, integrated pest management, and a few agrochemical criteria as well. 5 out of the 41 criteria showed improvements of at least 10 points, 3 showed reductions in at least 10 points. Cocoa farms in South America. The challenge areas here, mainly dealing with pesticide use and risk, and some related to livelihoods. These are medical exams, integrated pest management implementation, controlled access to workshops and storage areas, and an emergency response plan. 4 of the 41 criteria saw improvements of at least 10 points, 5 saw decreases. Some of the conclusions we can draw from these data are that there's new research that bolsters previous findings that RA certification is associated with increased productivity and improvement in farmer outlook. The new research since 2015 also finds that there are positive changes in numerous ecosystem and financial variables in the Ghana study, as well as improvements in pesticide management and black pod prevention. Consistent challenge areas among the regions were soil fertilization, agrochemical safety, buffers, medical exams, and shade cover. And in this region, or for this crop, we saw a relatively high number of criteria where the compliance scores increased or decreased by at least 10 points. Although I do need to mention that the prevalence of group certificates in the cocoa sector could be a reason, or part of the reason, why there were so many decreases. As new farmers enter the group, their weaknesses and their areas of non-compliance are added to that particular audit, even though the farmers that had previously been audited and have been in the group for a longer period of time are making changes and potentially improving their performance. So the challenges faced by the new farmers entering the group could be pulling the scores down slightly. Okay, bananas. Banana production trends, going from 2% of global production in 2011 to 6.4% in 2014. Production volumes and farm area, or production amounts in metric tons and farm area in hectares, both showing quite rapid growth since 2015. There's only one new research study that we were aware of, which looked at pest management and species diversity in Costa Rica. And this is one of the studies that allows us to take a step back and say, okay, there are lots of great studies out there showing us what we're doing well, and now there's also some out there that show us what we're not doing so well. So this is one of those. Although it had a relatively low sample size, looking at 5 Rainforest Alliance farms, 5 organic and 6 non-certified banana farms, they found that there were actually similar patterns of pesticide use on RA farms and non-certified farms, and also that RA farms and non-certified farms had relatively low insect and bird diversity compared to organic. So these are findings that we need to address and consider. The researchers who wrote the report suggest that these results may reflect the relatively high uptake of sustainable practices among non-certified banana farms in Costa Rica, resulting in fewer detectable differences. So the bar for many of these practices for non-certified farms due to regulation and other factors is actually relatively high, and that may be part of the reason that no differences were observed. However, this does tell us that we need to be focusing research in that area and understanding really what's going on there. So I wanted to tell you about 2 upcoming banana research initiatives that are supported by the Rainforest Alliance. One is called Impact Assessment of RA Certification on Banana Plantations in Colombia. And this is a comparison of working conditions, environmental conditions, and other variables on 15 farms that have recently achieved Rainforest Alliance certification, 15 that achieved it a longer time ago, and 15 non-certified farms. So we'll learn a lot in this study. The work is being conducted by researchers at Wageningen University and in partnership with in-country researchers, and it should be completed in the fall of 2018. Another study is a baseline study of environmental and social conditions on Rainforest Alliance certified farms, banana farms in Costa Rica and Belize, looking at 8 RA certified farms. This study is evaluating the environmental and social conditions on those farms, and it will also test the living wage method for collecting wage data, which I'll get into in more detail later. But this is sort of an innovation and a improved, we think, way of addressing wages and quality of life for farm workers. So this study is sort of testing that and preparing the methodology for use in the audit process in future. And this study will be completed in fall 2018. The banana research that was highlighted in the 2015 impacts report, really there was just one study conducted in Ecuador, and it found that compared to non-certified banana farms, Rainforest Alliance farms had higher productivity and higher rates of the following practices: creation of buffer zones, treating processing wastewater, disposing of plastic bags properly, and avoiding the use of paraquat, among others. The compliance analysis results, here we see the results for banana farms in Central America. There were 66 farms that were looked at in this analysis. Some of the challenge areas, so we're talking about now these 60 or less and 70 to 79 score categories. These were buffers between crops and areas of human activity and safe design of agrochemical storage areas. 3 criteria of the 41 we examined had increases in their scores of 10 or higher, and 1 had a decrease of that amount. Banana farms in South America, also we looked at 66 here. The challenge areas that were observed were, again, buffers between crops and areas of human activity and safe design of and controlled access to agrochemical storage areas. 3 criteria saw increases of 10 or more in their compliance scores, and 0 saw decreases. Some of the conclusions we can draw about bananas: there's been tremendous growth in production area and volumes in the past 3 years. More research is needed on impacts and is underway, in fact. And some of the consistent challenge areas identified are buffers and agrochemical storage. So looking forward, how do we use these results? The challenge areas that we've identified in our audit report analysis, there are a couple of different ways that we address those and work to reduce them. One way is by providing feedback on these results to project staff and field technicians who can tailor their training and technical assistance efforts to address the specific issues that were identified in the region and crop that they work in. Another way we can use this information is during the periodic revision process of the standard. So this provides us with opportunities to strengthen specific elements of the standard. We recently completed a revision process, and the new standard came into effect in July of 2017. And some of the changes that were made to that standard to address weaknesses were the change that the integrated pest management criteria, which had been a continuous improvement criterion, so not critical, was made critical. So now to become certified and remain certified, farmers must be in full compliance with that criterion. The new standard also introduces a new pesticide risk mitigation process. So in addition to increasing the number of pesticides that are outright banned for certified farmers from 100 to 150, now for an additional 150 or 170 agrochemicals and pesticides that are permitted, farmers, if they're using those, need to access a risk mitigation database and set of information that will tell them for that specific chemical, what can they do to minimize the risk to ecosystem health, their own health, and that of their families. So it's a chemical specific set of instructions on variables such as, should they not be using it when it's windy? Should they be waiting a certain period of time before re-entering the field? Very specific guidance on ways to minimize risk. In addition, in the new standard, we've introduced the living wage concept. I don't have time in this presentation to go through that in great detail, but essentially the Global Living Wage Coalition is a group of NGOs, including Rainforest Alliance, and scientists who are working to develop methodologies to calculate the living wage that's appropriate in different regions. The living wage being the minimum amount of hourly wage that a worker must receive to be able to afford a decent standard of living that covers their costs of food, clothing, housing, and basically 8 essential needs. So that concept is now formally introduced to our standard. Previously, the requirement was that farmers needed to be paying their workers at least minimum wage. That's still there, but the living wage, in addition, they have to create and then implement a living wage plan so that in regions where a living wage benchmark exists, so that calculation has already been made, they have to eventually meet that living wage number in terms of hourly wages. And in places where there's no benchmark yet calculated, there are a number of other things that they need to do to address essential needs, such as providing health care, providing inflation-adjusted increases to wages, and things like that. Another important criterion that has become mandatory in the last revision of the standard is the conservation and restoration of native vegetation on farms. And we've also introduced the concept of high conservation value forests to our farm standard as well. So those are some of the ways we've changed the content of the standard to address areas of weakness and areas that we've observed are needing to be strengthened. We can also change the overall scoring structure of the standard to mandate and make mandatory continuous improvement over time. So as you might remember in the graphs that I showed with the green bars, for most regions, many regions and crop region groupings, there were relatively high amounts of dark green. So there were quite a few criteria where the average score was 90 to 100. So either at full compliance or just about at full compliance. But for some regions, there was relatively slow improvement over time. So the number of criteria that we're seeing increases in their scores were, 0 to 3 out of 41. So that's something that we wanted to address. And we did so by creating a new continuous improvement framework in the new 2017 standard, which basically makes improvement mandatory. So instead of, in addition to increasing the number of critical or mandatory criteria from 23 in the old standard to 37 in the new one, all of the non-mandatory or what we call continuous improvement criteria were also designated in one of three categories, C, B, or A. And for each of those categories, there's time-bound limits on when the criteria within that category must be complied with. So it's no longer possible to reach, a good high level of performance and just stay there. Now you need to get above the bar to get certified, but there's going to be checks and balances and time-bound benchmarks for you to meet in the years after certification. So it's a pretty significant change that we're quite excited about. So in addition to those changes in the standard, we also can use what we know about weaknesses or challenge areas to conduct additional research and really understand what's happening and what we can do to mitigate those problems. So one thing we do in the evaluation and research program is to identify priority research topics that we think are questions that urgently need to be answered and that would help us with future efforts at Rainforest Alliance to increase impacts and change our programs. So that list of priority research topics is available online. It's on our website. And we also work with independent researchers to develop research topics when sometimes they come to us and say, hey, we'd like to do something on coffee in Central America. What's the most urgent question that you think needs to be answered? So we'll help identify research topics that way as well. Sometimes we also directly commission research if there is a specific question that we feel is urgent to answer. So some of the research through both of those mechanisms, just partnerships with independent researchers or commissioning, are listed here, in addition to the banana research that I already covered. Just a quick overview, one of the studies is using ecosystem modeling techniques to look at the effects of certification in the Tana Basin, Kenya, on water quality, sedimentation, and other water-related ecosystem variables. Another study is looking at the impacts of RA certification training on smallholder tea farmers in Sri Lanka. Another study is answering the question, where are commodity crops certified and what does it mean for conservation and poverty alleviation? Coffee certification and biodiversity in Mexico is being studied at the moment by a grad student. And another study is called Learning from Early Adopters of the Accountability Framework, and is looking specifically at that new initiative. So in addition to working with researchers to have more studies and more relevant studies, we also try to make suggestions that can improve the data that we collect ourselves through Rainforest Alliance's monitoring and evaluation system. So I'm not going to go into these in too much detail, but just some examples of some current initiatives. One is to enhance the farm level data collection. So obviously we're already using farm level information from the audit reports in the compliance analysis that I showed you today. But there's other information that farmers that farmers are required to provide to auditors, and that could be useful for us in analyzing and understanding impacts directly on the farm. So we're working on a mechanism to, without creating extra work for auditors and farmers, document and systematize information that they're already looking at during the audit process. In addition, we're doing a pilot project to digitize the group internal management systems. So right now, when groups get certified, there is what's called an internal management system, and that's a series of processes and procedures whereby the group manager can make sure that individual farmers are in compliance with the standard. In the interim between audits, training for individual farmers, just general management. Those documents are typically paper, just written down in a book in an office somewhere, and we're experimenting with the idea of digitizing those so that real-time information is available both to us but also to the farms themselves on what's happening and any risk areas or other characteristics they need to know about. Finally, we're also working to scale up some new spatial analysis requirements. There's a lot of possibilities for combining spatial data from certified farms with satellite imagery to understand the location of farms in the landscape and what that means about risk or proximity to high conservation or high biodiversity areas or protected areas, things like that. So there's much we can learn by just enhancing the digital information on polygons and other spatial information we have from individual farms. So there's lots more to learn about and to read about, and I encourage you to check out the impacts report itself if you haven't already. It's available at this website. And I think we'll just open it up to questions at this point. Thanks everyone for joining. I think the questions be added to the chat box. I was actually supposed to mention that at the beginning of the presentation, sorry. But I think just raising hands will also work. So please go ahead and let us know if you have any questions.
Thanks, Deanna. So it's Carrie. We have one question here in the chat box. The question that we have from Mike Aquino is, does the averaging of the regional scores consider various farm sizes?
No. The way I guess that potentially could be accounted for is the fact that the farms that were selected for this analysis were all randomly selected. So in theory, that means that we're going to get a sampling of all of the different size farms that are within a region. But I mean, we do have that information, so it would be possible to use that as a covariate and compare different size farms and their impact, their compliance scores. So that's a great idea, and yeah, maybe we could do that in future efforts.
Okay, great. It looks like Edward has a question. I'm going to unmute him in a second, but if anyone else has a question, please do add it to the chat box. Edward, you're unmuted. Do you have a question?
Thanks, and thank you to Deanna. It's really interesting, and of course, even though you distributed this a while ago, it's nice to see the presentation. You brought up a really important point that we always struggle to deal with adequately, which is the feedback loop. If we see the M&D monitoring as like the end of a line of training, of certification, etc., you know, it then needs to feed back into upgraded training and so on, just as you said. And these results need to get systematized as you are doing here, and then fed back in a way that's incorporated into training and learning and so on. And I haven't really got a question. I just wanted to say that as we figure out our new ways of working and our new structure, there's just something we can't take our eye off, because it's a constant challenge, but it's so important, because that's the real value of this data, not just to write impact reports or proposals, but also to continuously improve the quality of our own work in the field. So I just wanted to emphasize that point, as it was a long presentation, and that rather important point was somewhere in the middle of it.
Yeah, thanks, Edward. That I completely agree. I'll just mention that in the merger process right now, and the strategy and the creating sort of the new RA after the merger with UTS back in early January. Through that process, this is exactly one of the issues that's been identified within ENR as something that needs to be improved greatly, and new systems in place and approaches attempted. I mean, others have been attempted in the past, but we need to bolster this aspect, and that's definitely on our radar within ENR, and you can rest assured that you'll be asked to provide input on our ideas in the coming months. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Edward. So one additional question that came through, why do you think there is relatively little research on tea, and is there anything to be done? Is there anything to be done to encourage more research on tea?
I really don't have any idea on what drives a researcher's decision to look at a certain crop and a certain topic. I don't know if there's fewer resources available in tea producing, for researchers in tea producing countries. I can't imagine really that's the main reason. Possibly they're looking at other certification programs and not Rainforest Alliance. I don't have any insights at all into why that is. But yeah, hopefully it'll be resolved and more research will be done soon.
Great. So if there aren't any other questions, I don't see any others coming in here. Then I think that's a wrap.
Okay, thanks, Carrie, and thanks everyone for joining us. Please check out the report online, and a recording of this will also be available. So tell your friends. Goodbye, thanks.